My name is Ricky Burdett. I'm, together with Philip Rode, Priya Shankar, have been responsible for organizing this event in Delhi. I'm delighted to see so many old friends and new friends at this event. Craig is right when he says that every event is different, and this one certainly has been. I have two tasks today, and what I want to do is put the slides up as quickly as possible, rather than look at me. That's much better, thank you. And one is pretty boring, and the other one hopefully not. The boring one is to really tell you how the logistics work through these 2 days, and what the sort of the codes of behavior in a way are. You see how many people are in the room. It's fantastic that you're all here. There are about 60 speakers in 2 days. We've already heard how many different places they come from. This really means one thing, that we have to all stick to time. So when it actually comes to the keynote speakers, the panelists at the table, or even questions from the floor, which we will have a number of those sessions, we really do ask you to stick to time. Now, there's a well-known tradition at the LSE, I have to say, which we've decided to export, and it's known as the yellow card. Right? Now, I know it's a football analogy, but basically, I will be doing this to the most important people in the room when you've got 2 minutes left, 1 minute left, and Ed Glazer, stop. Right? So I think that really applies to everyone here throughout the 2 days. Try, when we come to questions, which we will have, as you see from the notes above me, open discussions. We have roving mics. Say who you are and put a question. Don't make a statement, please, because that's not really the point. Try and engage with the conversation as it's been before you run, make a long statement. I've already suggested that, in fact, there are 3 sorts of events, effectively, here throughout the 2 days. There are keynote speeches, there are panel discussions at the chair, and then open discussions, as I've also suggested. Because we've made, I think, an important effort to include in this document that you have here everyone's of the panelists and speakers' CVs. That's the 2 pages in the middle. We will not be spending time as we introduce the panels talking about people's CVs. So don't take that personally. We all think you're terribly important, that's why you're here. But don't be offended because we're not actually saying how many Oscars you won or where you got your PhD from. The important thing is to have as much time available for discussion together. The day, as I say, is very much clear from the yellow document which is inside your conference newspapers. There will be 1 or 2 changes, people who've been stuck at airports or who just can't make it, but on the whole, everything that is here is more or less how we're actually going to run the event. Craig has already alluded to sort of the major themes that we're going to be dealing with. We are going to have several sessions, and you can see them effectively in the white bits, which are there, and then there are interspersed between that coffee breaks, lunches, and a big dinner that Thomas Matusek will tell us at the end of today, hosted by the German ambassador. But we'll give you the details of that. So we want to try and keep the time in between those sessions. I'm very aware that we've started a bit late today, but that's to be expected. We're only around 10, 15 minutes running late. So the structure of these events is very much around the themes of devolution and decentralization. Greg Clark has already practically talked about every single theme in your introduction. The issue of accountability, the issue of partnership, the issue of land governance, the issue of infrastructure, and of course urban leadership, and how all that, and we come to that at the end of tomorrow evening, how all that really plays into a discussion about the future of India and how its cities might be better governed in a different way. These are questions we're raising. We're not here, as Richard Sennett always said when we started thinking of this process, all the urban age can do is actually put up a mirror and reflect together on what the key issues are in cities. We are not here in any way from the global north, or certainly from London, to, in a way, actually describe what the solutions are to your country or any country, where it's an intellectual discussion and a reflection together on what should be happening to cities worldwide. That's the boring bit finished, okay? So I now want to talk a little bit about some of the research that the London School of Economics, LSE Cities, the group, in fact, supported and sponsored by Deutsche Bank, has been doing in this occasion, all of which is summarized effectively in this document here. So the newspaper has been produced, it's published today for the first time, all of you, I hope, have one, and effectively this document has two different things. It has a series of essays by many of the people sitting in the room here, but also others, which are observations on global phenomena when it comes to issues of governance. It has essays on India, and it has reflections of effectively what's happening in other parts of the world when it comes to governing cities, particularly in conditions of risk and uncertainty. But in the middle of the document is what we call our data section, which is full of numbers and maps, so that's pretty straightforward. And I just want to touch upon some of the key findings as a sort of introduction to many of the issues we're going to be talking about over the next 2 days. Now, all that is informed by the work we've been doing for 10 years. It's not just an instant piece of research, it's very much to do with this global network of research which started in 2004 with our colleagues at the Alfred Herrhausen Society, and we're ending up, as it happens, this year in Delhi. Now, the context for this has been talked about already by the previous speakers. But just look at this map. It reminds us not just where urbanization is happening, but the speed at which it's happening. These numbers reflect the number of people either born or moving into cities per hour. So this means for every minute and a half that I speak or anyone else, someone new is moving into either Lagos, and we'll hear about this from Babatunde Fashola, the governor, tomorrow, and many parts of the Asian world that you see there. In London, yes, Greg, it's getting better, but boy, is it slow by comparison to here. And what is fascinating, of course, is that many Russian cities, some American cities, and even Tokyo are actually going to go in negative growth over the next years. So not the whole world is expanding, and I know Neil Brenner will be talking about how do you define urbanization anyway? These are very, very important questions which we do not take for granted. Every time we've had a conference, we've done a series of research projects looking at health, looking at smart cities, looking at urban transformations, and we've really realized one thing, that unless we talk about governance, we haven't solved anything. So that's why this conference really for us is a sort of pulling together many of the big strands and thinking and inquiries and questions that we've had over the years. Governing urban futures is a question mark that we're sharing with you. So what did we find about Delhi, which is in a way partly relevant to this and gives a bit of an X-ray of the issues which matter to this and other cities? Well, Greg alluded to this already at the beginning. How cities are governed, not whether you have a mayor or not, but what the boundary of that city is absolutely fundamental. Here you see 6 cities, some of which are illustrated in the report, where you see in the sort of slightly darker color the city authority where the mayor, let's say, is responsible. Look at São Paulo on the bottom right, for example. The shape of a dog, the face of a dog. That's the mayor of São Paulo. The city itself, the functional region that Greg called, is much larger than that. Now, London reinvented itself, and I'm going to come back to this, to try and have as much of a close fit between the two. So we've actually done some research here. You'll look at it much more carefully in the publication, and I hope it will be useful, to compare the red bit, effectively where the city population is, fits or doesn't fit in terms of the wider metropolitan area. There are, in some cases, very radical differences between the bigger numbers and the smaller numbers, but basically in some cities, what you find, like Istanbul, that actually it's 100% fit, because the region that the mayor of Istanbul has under his control is vast. And you look at actually Paris, it's only 18%. Think why? That's the center of Paris, the historical core is tiny in relation to the Ile-de-France, which is the functional region. Has Paris suffered from that? Probably yes. And of course, Delhi is in a sort of interesting position at the moment. I'm not going to go into that because so many others are going to be talking about who rules the city and how it's actually governed. But actually, roughly 66%, 2/3 of the, let's call it, metro population lives within the, so to speak, city boundary. All of this is, and more, is laid out in the center spread, effectively, here. And we can't see anything on the screen, but we look at a whole series of parameters for 9 different cities. Delhi at the top, Berlin, Istanbul, New York, and others on the side. And we looked at governance issues, for example, how long is the mayoral term? We've looked at how many Twitter followers mayors have, for example. It's quite interesting. And we've looked at issues to do with the performance of the environment, social, economic, and spatial issues to do with density and all that, and tried to compare them across it. This is very much what the urban age has been able to do and will continue to do in terms of collecting an understanding and asking questions about urban organization. Let's take a few salient and I think interesting facts about Delhi and compare them to the 9 cities that we've looked at. Well, one is that Delhi, we've heard it before from Anshu and others, is growing actually very fast. It's starting from a lower base than others, but in the next 15 years or so, we're actually going to have a growth of 7%. Now, London is picking up, but it's less than half than that. Lagos is much closer to that, and Tokyo is only 1.1%. Now, interestingly, over the same time span, which should be 2012 to 2030, not 23, so as you see there, over the same time period, 7% improvement GVA, so income, but only 2% actually population growth in this city and metro region. Lagos, instead, it's closer. The two are much closer. There's very large population growth. Tokyo, in the same time, I've already talked about this, will actually lose 400,000 people. 400,000 people in what today is the world's largest metro region. Now, inequality in this city, like many fast-growing cities in Africa, Asia, Latin America, is actually quite high, measured by the Gini index. Berlin and London are lower figures, which means the society is more equal. Now, one expects that, but the key issue of governance, Greg has talked about this, is how do you deal with inequality? And we will have several sessions which address that. In Lagos, it's still actually quite high, as you see there. But there are extraordinary assets in living in India. The violence, despite recent issues, particularly against women, when it comes to, for example, the murder rate, is incredibly low. The homicide rate in this city is 2.7 people per 100,000 people. Now, the mayor of Bogota, Peñalosa, who is here, will recognize, unfortunately, that though things have got better in that wonderful Latin American city, the numbers are nearly, well, you can see it there, 16% rather than 2.7%. And New York, which has got better too, is nearly twice the number. More issues to do with the environment. Delhi, despite the great Lutyens environment, is actually a very dense city. It's a very efficient city, you could say, with pretty limited amount of space, green space per person when you look at the whole region. In fact, in London, it's 36 square meters a person. Just think of that, you know, how many square meters? That's about 30 people around you per person, and in this case, it's actually smaller. Istanbul is even worse, I have to say. It's the bottom statistic there, which is the most troubling for all of us. We cannot ignore climate change. We cannot have a discussion about governance without understanding the consequences. And I think you all know in this room, and some of you can feel it in your chest and your throat, that actually the pollution levels are incredibly high, perhaps unacceptably high for a city which has such important ambitions. Density, I've talked about. Would you think that a city of about 4 or 5 stories high is denser, has more people in a way living and working together than Tokyo? Well, our density maps, which you see here, actually reflect that. On the left, The taller the map, the taller the graph, the more density, the more people are together. It means in this room, we would have 20 more people in this space, and if we were instead in Tokyo, it would be this number of people. If it were London, we'd have a third less, just to give you a sense. That's what density actually means. This has enormous consequences in terms of the efficiency in the city and also how you govern it. Let me conclude by comparing with some other cities around the world that we look at, just to share the issues with you and, in a way, set the scene before we move to the first panel discussion, which will be in the center table in a moment. Well, let's take São Paulo, not because São Paulo is particularly problematic, but São Paulo is another vast city, an engine of the Brazilian economy, and it looks like that. What a familiar scene, right, in this city, of course. How has São Paulo actually dealt with traffic problems? Like this. There are 1,000 or so helicopters in São Paulo, roughly the same as Tokyo and New York, but the income difference is really quite different. This is one way the market has responded, and we have all probably, even in São Paulo, had to take a helicopter to avoid the 4 hours average commuting problem. There are solutions to this, and we'll hear them throughout the day. Another fundamental issue is the issue of literally size. Where does the city end? Mexico City doesn't end. It just does not end. This picture could be extended across the room, and it doesn't end. Now, there's another way of doing it in a city. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but certainly understanding how to contain a city growth is a fundamental aspect of governance. Let me end, as I say, by sharing a London issue. We don't want to be London-centric, but just to say we've had some problems that we need to understand. This is London, you see the River Thames. This is another map of exactly the same city, and all it does is show in dark red where people are most deprived. I'm not going to go through it in detail. Every city will have this map, okay? But basically, darker reds means lower levels of education, higher employment, teenage pregnancies, etc. In green, exactly the opposite. Higher education, longer life expectancy, and lower levels of unemployment. There's an unequal distribution, which us social scientists at the LSE and some few friends represent as this. This is an analytic, social scientific analysis of the city. But the point is, we all understand this. This is what London actually feels like. So how do you try and change this over time? And particularly, as the three previous speakers have talked about, how do you try and avoid this before it happens? We saw the inequality measures in Delhi. We will hear in the conversation about South African cities, that this is actually happening. How do you stop it from happening? Well, in London, we actually had to reinvent, Greg has talked about this, a system. And the system was not working. We never, for 15 years, never had any form of representation because the Greater London Council, which effectively was formed in 1889 as the London County Council, was abolished. And in the year 2000, this chap, Ken Livingstone, actually became the mayor of the whole of London, replaced by this chap. And you can imagine where he's going. As a result of that, we've actually used the opportunity to study different systems, and you'll find this in the report in the data section. And let's take the Mayor of London. In red is metropolitan governance. In blue at the top is central government. In green is, let's call it, more local representation at the borough level. What is missing here, it's very interesting, is an orange color, which is the state. If we go to Delhi, there's a lot of orange, not very much red, right? Some green. So it's also important not just to discuss governance, but to understand which institutions are there. And Jerry Fu will be talking about this later. Who decides who actually can make the decisions and what level of representation is there? My final point really tries to bring the two biggest issues, the two biggest challenges that cities face, that we've been studying out at the Urban Age, which are the environment and social cohesion. This map, this graph, shows on the right-hand side, as you go further up, the ecological footprint. The further up you go, the more energy per person you use. On the horizontal axis, it shows effectively the Human Welfare Index of the United Nations. The more you are on the right, the better educated, longer life expectancy, etc. It's no mystery, and there are a few Americans, me included, in the room, that the USA up there is, an extreme. And when you look at the dotted line and you realize that that is one Earth's level of energy we have, if we all live like our American friends, we need 5 Earths. 5 Earths. It's not going to work. So India is here at the moment, and that's the big point of transition. It's a fascinating moment. And in a way, the question is which way you go. Which model does one choose? And for us at the Urban Age, at the LSE, and with all our colleagues here, we're interested in this question. How does governance actually help us understand these questions?